and welcome to your next session of the Global University Climate Forum. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to students tuning into this pre-recorded session from all around the world. My name is Ashley Jankowski, and I am a fellow at the Yale Office of Sustainability, and I am thrilled to be here today with our two distinguished guests to discuss the topic of climate optimism. Here today with us is Christiana Figueres, an internationally recognized leader on global climate change. She served as the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2010 to 2016, and in this role was responsible for leading the international climate negotiations that led to the historic framework of the Paris Agreement. Also with us is Tom Carnac, a leader in the fields of international diplomacy, energy policy, and climate change. He ran the political strategy for the UN towards the Paris Climate Agreement and has a background in inspiring, measuring, and managing multi-stakeholder climate action. Our two guests co-authored an amazing new book titled The Future We Choose, and we are so excited to have them with us today. Welcome, Christiana and Tom.
Well, Ashley, thank you very much for having us. And could we say right at the outset that Tom and I did not actually plan to be wearing the same color shirt?
I forgot my necklace. That's the only reason we're not completely coordinated.
For a topic on climate optimism, we are all wearing dark.
And also that we're in the same place. This is the first time we've been together since lockdown began in March. So we're together in Costa Rica. We're going to be here for a week. So very exciting to be doing things actually IRL, as the kids say.
What's IRL?
In real life.
In real life?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, IRL to you then.
So I guess we can open up by discussing the topic of today's session. Again, this is an audience of 600 students coming from 47 countries around the world. We would really like to know what climate optimism means for youth action and youth activism in this moment, particularly in this political moment that we find ourselves.
You go. You're the youth in this pair.
So I don't know about that. So I think probably that's a great question, and kind of like it cuts to the heart of who do we want to be at this most consequential and transformative time in human history, right? So we all know this, and I'm sure that your listeners and the participants know this, but we have just entered the most consequential decade in human history. And that sounds like I'm exaggerating when I say that, but I'm really not. You know, by 2030, we either will have made this transition where we're on our way to having reduced emissions by at least 50% in the next 10 years, or we will be losing control of the climatic system to the point where it's no longer really possible for us to take action and avert the worst impacts of climate change down the line. Now, given that, we are living through a period of history that is going to have more of an impact on the future than any of those who came before us in the long arc of human history. So where we've come at from this is, how do we want to show up with that tremendous responsibility? Who do we want to be? Future generations will look back at this moment and they will say, my God, they lived at the fulcrum where both of these futures were possible. A regenerative future that had reforested the planet, that had reinvested in health and livelihoods and care for other people, or a future which is increasingly degenerated, which is marked by conflict, which is marked by destruction of the environment, painful loss of biodiversity.
And human misery.
And we can control that, right? I mean, we collectively have an opportunity to live, I would argue, the most meaningful possible of lives, because we are living at the time where we can have a big impact on that. Now, where we're coming at that from in that case is to say, there's only one way that we show up to that, and that is with determination and courage and appreciation of the challenge and the reality that we're facing, but with a deep and stubborn determination that actually we will do everything in our power to make sure that that arc turns out in the right way. And that's what we define as optimism. It's not saying we should wake up every morning and assume that everything's going to be fine, right? I mean, a casual glance outside will tell you that that's not the case. However, if you look back at human history, that type of gritty, determined optimism has been most relevant when the outlook has been the darkest, actually. We've had these moments of transformation where there's been these dark times, these challenging outlooks, but people have decided they will not submit to that reality, and they will do everything possible to change that. So that's what we're talking about climate optimism. Christiane.
Right.
You know, Tom, I have to say, it's actually, we say this, that this most critical, decisive, consequential decade, when we say that, both of us individually, it's so fun that we're doing this together, right? Because both of us individually say it's no exaggeration, and it's true. But what I think is very fun is that you're a Brit, and culturally, British people tend to understate things.
Yes, that's true.
I'm a Latin American, and culturally, Latin Americans tend to overstate.
Right.
But the fact is that is neither an understatement nor an overstatement.
It's not, exactly.
It is, and that, I think it's very hard for us to get our, to wrap our understanding around this concept, because to know that we have 10 years minus 10 months to get our act together, to determine which of these two pathways we're going to go, because you have to understand 2030 is basically the eye of the needle, right?
Yeah.
If we're going to go through 2030, because that's unavoidable, the question is, at what level of greenhouse gases will we get to by 2030? And that in and of itself, neither an understatement nor an overstatement, that in and of itself will determine the quality of life for us, for our children, for generations to come. It's very difficult to get our heads around the fact that we bear that responsibility. We are actually determining the future of humanity. How it's just very difficult for us to listen to that and truly integrate it, and then act accordingly.
And I'm sorry to keep going on, but we'll get to the next question in a minute. But the other thing which I think is really interesting there that I was reflecting on recently is, normally history comes at you without you knowing how consequential it is, right? If you look back at like great wars and things, people generally didn't know how consequential the time they were living through was. It was only later that these big changes happened. One of the other unique elements of this period of history is we know it's going to be consequential. We know the full scale of that impact, rather than sort of living through it and looking back thinking, oh, everything changed.
The other way of thinking about that is that usually we write history and then we read about it. In this case, right, we actually are holding that pen
as we
very actively as we go. And because usually we don't know that. We just, go through, then history is written later on, and then we read about it. But this time we're actually actively holding the pen. Every choice that we make, every choice about what we eat today, how we transport ourselves, what quality of energy we use, whether our homes, offices, buildings, and classrooms are energy efficient or not, where our savings are, how we vote in all kinds of elections, from local to national in every country. All of that, every single behavior of ours is actually determining what future generations are going to experience on this planet. Honestly, it's difficult to get your hands around that concept.
Right. And I know in your book you outline the 3 mindsets that you recommend readers should take as they're really considering what it means to hold the pen. How does that tie into the responsibility that we bear, and why are these mindsets so important?
Well, the mindsets are important because, as you will know, Ashley, and everyone else listening, how you go into, how you face a challenge has a huge impact on whether you are increasing your chances of success or decreasing your chances of success. You never face a challenge with guaranteed outcome. That is not the world that we live in. But if you go into a challenge, and you can choose any challenge that you want, academic challenge, professional challenge, health challenge, learn a language challenge, whatever you want. In this case, the quality of life on humans on this planet. And if you go in there with a negative mindset, you will probably, very likely, decrease your chances of success, because you're not going to give it your all. You're actually undermining your own agency at having the impact that you want. Whereas if you go in with a positive mindset, you are nurturing your own agency to affect the change that you want. And for us, those 3 mindsets actually work together in consonance with each other. And it is stubborn optimism that Tom has just explained. It's also about a regenerative mindset and behavior, because we have depleted the natural resources on this planet. And we have to be able to go out there and actually actively regenerate. It does no good, or at least not enough, to simply remove the stress that we have put on the planet. We have removed the stress from many ecosystems throughout this year. And we have seen that nature has come back with some resilience. And that's very good news. It's sort of a test case for stress removal. But when it comes to climate and when it comes to the levels of greenhouse gases that we have to reduce, we can't just remove the stress. We actually have to actively regenerate and reinvigorate the resilience capacity of the planet, of soils, of oceans, of all ecosystems. We have to go out there and help those ecosystems recapture the resilience that they originally had. Because think of it, Ashley, as though it were a rubber band, if you will, and we have been stretching and stretching and stretching and stretching that rubber band to the point where it's about to pop. If it pops, there is no crazy glue that will put it together. And what we have to do is bring it back to where it has that resilience, because we will need, if there's any lesson from COVID, is that we need a world that is much more resilient. We will be hit by many different global challenges, and we can't have a brittle world. We have to have a resilient world, and we're about to lose that resilience in the world. So we have to actively regenerate that resilience. And then, of course, this collaboration, because as Tom said, there's no way that you and Tom and I individually, or the people that are with us today, can do this alone. We have to do it in collaboration with each other.
And one more point I make on that is just, we talk about this concept of abundance in the book, this idea of endless abundance. And when we're facing, it's very easy, and we sort of, by the economic system that we've grown up in, the way the education system works, we tend, in a way that we don't always reflect on, to see the world in terms of scarcity, right? We tend to value what is scarce, things, their price goes up if they become more scarce. And if you think about what that mindset could do in a world that is running out of resources, that has increasing strain on multiple resources, including the space of the atmosphere to absorb carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, then that could actually be a real degeneration of our society and the beginning of a real sense of conflict. But actually, it's really important to examine our assumptions and realize that that has been a choice, and that we don't have to see the world like that. There are lots of things that are truly abundant around the nature of human relationships, even the nature of things like energy. I mean, solar is endlessly abundant. We can shift to a way in which, instead of meaning that if I'm going to win, it's going to be because I've made you lose, or the other way around, that now either we're all going to win or we're all going to lose, and we're all on the same side of this part of history in the next 10 years.
Tom, sorry, but those sun rays are mine. They're not
That's right.
yours.
That's right. Yeah, I'm going to turn it off when I'm done.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, we're using the terms abundance and climate optimism, and these terms might sound a little bit privileged, particularly to communities who have been historically burdened by environmental injustices and who are now disproportionately affected by the impacts of COVID-19. Their health, their livelihoods have been impacted, and they're angry. Can you tell us how the mindsets that you outline in The Future We Choose align with the demands of the environmental justice movement and this larger concept of a just transition?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Ashley. Really, really very important question. And it makes those mindsets all the more important and all the more urgent, because those people who have been on the short stick of natural resources, of financial resources, of health, of food, obviously, they feel that for them that scarcity is a huge, powerful, and painful reality, because they've been on the short stick of that. So it's very understandable that for them, it's very difficult to change their mindset into that. That is why it's important that those that are on the long stick of this really understand that we cannot continue to act like this, that my sun rays are not for Tom, right? We have to understand that actually we have an abundance here that we have to actively share, not hoard. That's the difference. It's about not hoarding, not putting into my space and saying, this is mine and therefore it's not yours. We have to get to the point where we see that there is an abundance of energy, of natural resources, of food. In fact, we think, right, that food is scarce. And there are many people, there are about 1 billion people that are food insecure. That is a crime, because the fact is, we have enough food on the planet. We produce enough food for everyone to get what they need for a healthy life. What we're not doing is distributing that properly. So if we understand that it's not about me having food, but Tom, no, it's about all of us understanding that we do have enough food, we do have enough energy, we do have enough well-being. And those of us who've been on the long stick of all of that need to take up the responsibility to share that in a fair, just way.
Right. And at this forum, we have 600 student participants from 47 countries. Less than a third are from developed countries, and quite a few are from the least developed countries that are being deeply impacted by COVID as well as climate change. What policies and actions might be most impactful in these varied circumstances, and how might a forum like this, bringing all of these students together, help to empower those students?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the power of the forum and the interconnectivity of young people coming together to address these challenging issues from a genuinely global base and from multiple different countries, looking at how that issue affects everybody, is incredibly powerful, right? And those are the types of alliances and partnerships that we need to ensure that we can actually move forward together. I mean, one of the things we often talk about in the aftermath of COVID, and this has been true in developed countries certainly, and to a degree in developing countries as well, is policymaking has drifted from a scientific base over the course of the last decades, right? And particularly in the last 5 years. So what we now see, and we now see this reemerging, we feel strongly as a result of the inability to heed the warnings of the COVID pandemic. And don't forget, this pandemic was not an unexpected event. On one level, it was the most expected event and the most predicted event. But now that we're beginning to see that people are realizing the effect of ignoring science, ignoring the warnings of science and the ability to take preemptive action, the reemergence of that scientific basis of policymaking, I mean, that's what we need to come back to, right? Policy doesn't need to be based on what we say or anything, it needs to be based on science. And the fact that we've allowed that to drift is part of why we're getting into more of a challenging situation. So I would say that that is the clear demand that young people on the streets around the world have been very consistent about, and that now, as those people, and maybe many of those people listening, start moving in their careers into, working in policymaking, working in business, that demand has to now filter into all areas of society, because that's how we're going to start making the right choices.
Right. And at the heart of this forum is really the idea that higher education institutions are the knowledge sector, and colleges and universities around the world are and should be dedicated to generating knowledge rather than a profit. And we have the capacity to test ideas and act as a neutral forum while preparing tomorrow's leaders. Do you have thoughts on how this sector might play an active role in the ideas that you just put forth?
Well, Ashley, there's it presents a challenge because we have to be able to act both in the short term as well as in the mid and long term. And so academic institutions are incredibly critical to prepare leadership for the mid and long term. And that cannot stop, because the fact is the time, just goes by very, very quickly. So that needs to continue. And especially, I would say, especially important to prepare leadership in developing countries, because we know that the future of the planet lies in the hands of developing countries. So good on you, UMass, for being able to do that. Now, at the same time, we cannot, because we've run out of time on climate, we cannot wait for mid and long-term leadership to turn this around. Those of us who have been out of school for a while a long while, decades in my case, not yours, also have the responsibility to do everything that is within our power and influence to begin to turn this huge ship that we're on onto the right path. And then, of course, welcome with open arms the midterm and long-term leadership that is coming up. But I cannot export the responsibility of shifting the course to young people. Because A, I think it's unfair because it's not you who caused this problem, it's my generation. And B, we're still sitting, some of us, we're still sitting at the decisive or at the decision tables. And so to say someone, you know, as someone who says, oh, I'm so glad the young people are going to save the world. Really? I just think that is irresponsible because that is not where young people are sitting right now. First, secondly, it's unfair to expect them to right our wrongs. So this is about intergenerational. It is about intergenerational justice, right? Because young people will be much more impacted than my generation. But it's also about intergenerational collaboration. It's not about intergenerational confrontation. It's about intergenerational collaboration where my generation needs to assume the responsibility to do everything that we can while we're still here to right the wrongs, to get us on a right path, and then turn over the baton to those who will continue. We're not going to address climate change over the next 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, or even 5 years. This is a long-term haul, and that's why it requires the participation of all generations.
Right. And I mean, that brings up a really excellent segue. You know, this forum is taking place in what would have been COP25 and is the 5th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement, where you both were instrumental in accomplishing the historic unanimous signing through what has been called collaborative diplomacy. How should consensus building and finding common ground with others, either in different generations or diversity in geography, become part of youth activism and action?
So, I mean, to me, that it's one of the great tragedies of the last few years and the legacy, not only of this, but, you know, the election of Donald Trump in the United States and the change of tone that's led to how you engage with opponents around the world. And it's not just that, you know, I mean, Bolsonaro in Brazil and other leaders around the world as well. And there's been a fraying of that sense that actually you can come together and get big things done that was still quite sort of trendy in 2015, right, at the end of Obama's term. And we thought that was the beginning of a sort of period of global collaboration. It turns out, of course, that, you know, the world doesn't turn out as you think it will. However, you know, if you listen now, we're recording this on US election day. And so the viewers will know what's happened and we don't yet. I just listened yesterday to Joe Biden appearing on Brene Brown's podcast, Unlocking Us. And if you haven't heard it, it's really worth listening to because it's a 40-minute conversation about his idea of leadership and whether what you're looking for is power over others or power to do something together or power with others or unlocking power within yourself. And what he talks about very compellingly, and it's not just it's him, it's others as well, is that really to get stuff done, we can't allow this idea of collaboration and multi-stakeholder engagement to wither in the way that this president has claimed to sort of move beyond it with his combative style. That's how you come together and get stuff done. And there's no examples in history of anybody who's been able to be successful in doing anything meaningful over the long term who hasn't understood that. So, you know, completely agree with Christiana's point about the fact that there are those of us at the decision-making table who still have the responsibility to do everything we can, and that responsibility can't be passed over. But I've been really impressed with the young people I know at their deep instinct towards that collaborative consensus building, deep listening, appreciating where people come from, understanding, you know, the role of privilege and how you mitigate that as you try and find a way forward and make space for everybody. I mean, to me, that's one of the great sources of hope at the moment, is that actually those instincts are really strong, and I think that will lead to amazing outcomes over time.
Right. And in your book, you talk a lot about engaging with political actors and those in power. That being said, divestment from fossil fuels is a strong rallying cry among students in developed countries. Can you share with us your vision for a future with little or no dependence on fossil fuels, your ideals on how to get there, and your thoughts on how these student protests fit in?
Well, we actually think student protests are great. We speak a lot about civil disobedience in the book because we realize from a quick look at history that nothing that is truly politically, social, or economically consequential has ever really occurred without civil disobedience. I mean, yes, we have many changes, but that are of a smaller impact, but on climate change, on decarbonizing our economy, that is consequential enough that it does need civil disobedience. So we are moving toward numbers that will make a huge difference. It's 3 point what percent?
3.5%, yeah.
3.5% has been historically the number that is necessary for any population. Let's say in the United States, 3.5%, or in any other country, or globally, 3.5% of the population doing civil disobedience acts has proven over history to be enough to turn the tide. So that's very doable, right? It's not like you need 50% of the population on the streets. No, you need 3.5. And had it not been for COVID, we probably would be pretty close to 3.5 now in many countries. So let's see, you know, hopefully we can pick that up next year as soon as possible. But it is a very important accelerator of change when it is clear that tolerance is back down to zero. What those civil disobedience movements do is they demonstrate and they voice quite clearly lack of tolerance for irresponsible decisions, for, in this case, for fuels that did a great job last century. And we should thank them for the help that they provided all of us for the economic development, particularly in some countries, not in others. And that was a very important motor of economic and social development. But it is no longer. It is no longer, because we now understand what we didn't understand last century, that those fuels also have a huge negative consequence. We did not know that. But fossil fuels are the hotbed of climate change emissions. They are the responsible ones, 70%. The other 30% is land use, irresponsible land use management. But 70% of the responsibility of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the burning of fossil fuels, whether that's to produce electricity or whether that's to move our vehicles. But all of that together is 70%. Now, the fact is that this century, we have realized that negative consequence that we didn't know about, but also, luckily, we have developed and will continue to develop the alternatives. So renewable energy, whether it be wind or solar, has come down in price 80% over the past few years. It is now competitive against new coal in many countries. And so there's no excuse. In fact, there is no room for any new coal anywhere in the world. There are some countries that are still dependent on coal, and they have to be supported by international financial resources to get off their coal dependency. Because what is really tragic is that many of those countries that are still coal dependent are also countries of utter misery and utter poverty. And the coal is producing more poverty, because when you understand that coal equals climate change, and climate change implications and negative implications hit the poor nations and the poor people in those nations most, then you understand that coal equals increased poverty. That's why we have to get out of coal. And luckily we have solar and wind to substitute for electricity. And we are investing quite a bit into green hydrogen that will help us with what we call the hard to abate sectors, which are transport and industrial uses, typically of fossil fuels. So we are developing the alternatives. We just don't have them fast enough. But those that are there, we have to be able to penetrate the grids of the world with much more renewable energy, because those are already mature. We don't really have to invest that much in them. Yes, we have to invest into electrification of transport and certainly into battery technology and charging technologies. And down the line, we will come with green hydrogen for other uses. So we will eventually actually have a basket of fuels that will speak to and address all of the uses that we need. Remember that with growing population and also with poverty levels coming up into the middle class, we will both of that, the rising of people out of poverty into the middle class, as well as increased population, will increase energy demand. So let's not fall into, the simplification of thinking, oh, well, we're not going to have any more. We have more energy demand coming at us, and hence a much more important market for energy generation and distribution. And that energy demand needs to be met with responsible fuels, with responsible energy sources.
Right. Thank you for that. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be really excited to hear that civil disobedience has an impact, has a measurable impact. That being said, this year has posed an extraordinary amount of uncertainty and stress on students, in addition to the normal stressors of university life. How do you recommend that students manage their feelings of climate grief and exhaustion in order to be the activists that we need them to be in this time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and you're right. I mean, it was inflicting a heavy psychological toll even before anything emerged this year. And you're right, the additional stress of everything that's happened has made it one of the most difficult roles to be holding at this moment, right? Now, one thing that we would say, and the research from the book really played out, is that the one thing that makes the biggest difference to mitigating a sense of anxiety and grief is to start taking action, right? Because when it's coupled with a sense of powerlessness and being excluded from the types of actions that are actually going to shape your future, then it becomes really intolerable. But just start taking action in your life and appreciate, we do this funny thing psychologically in climate where we say, if I don't have control over the whole outcome, then my contribution is meaningless, right? We say, because I can only do a small thing, my contribution isn't really worth anything, so therefore I feel powerless. Actually, in many other areas of life, and particularly I would sort of point at spiritual development, or not only that, but caring for loved ones, it's the absence of control that gives meaning, right? I can't control an outcome in looking after a sick child or looking after a sick parent or embracing, a faith or a spiritual pursuit that I care about. But it's that absence of control that makes it meaningful. So therefore, you just do the next right thing. You take action, wanting to be on the right side of history, being determined that you will play your role at this moment, taking action in your life, talking with others, being determined to play that part, actually in itself can precipitate an ongoing building towards a healthier psychology in the face of great challenges. So I would say those are the things that I would think about.
The other way to think about it, Ashley, is to think about addressing climate change as a team sport. It's not an individual sport. It's a team sport. And in a team sport, you know that your individual participation is important, but it is not solely responsible for winning the game. It is only through the coordinated and optimizing effort of everyone that team actually moves to success. And so, that when you go into a game as a team member, you want to give it your all, but you also expect everyone else to do the same. And it is only by everyone doing their best that you stand a chance of success.
Great. Well, we are so thankful that you both joined us today. I would love to be able to leave our audience members with the action items they need to be good team members. So can you give us the top 3 things that any citizens can commit to that will make a real difference?
So I say the first, one of the easiest ones is around diet. Actually, there's an amazing confluence of health and climate beneficial actions. So, and
human health and planetary
health and planetary health, exactly, same thing.
Yeah.
And actually, interestingly, a lot of people are now choosing to cut out meat altogether, or to even cut out dairy products, etc. But you don't even have to go that whole way if you don't want to. We're on track for, I understand, there's a very significant uptick in the number of meals that are plant-based, even if the number of people who are wholly plant-based isn't going up as fast. So do what's possible there and realize that that's all to the good in that regard. So that's one. I mean, the second I would point out, Christian might have a slightly different list, I don't know, we'll find out, would be around travel. There are always ways to amend travel and look at it differently. Obviously, that's different at this moment around COVID, but a significant number, particularly for those of us in developed countries, a significant amount of our emissions will come from getting on planes. How can we mitigate that and do things differently, even if we can't get it to zero? And then the third thing I would say is actually back to civil disobedience. It might be that students don't have, large pension pots that they can pressure their trustees, but they can actually engage with the trustees of the pension fund at the university and encourage them to divest or reinvest in a regenerative future. So those are three things that I would say should be within the reach of most people, most students.
Yeah, and if we're allowed a fourth, Ashley.
You are allowed a fourth.
Thank you. To that, I would add, talk to your friends, talk to your family members. We are no longer in the situation in which we can afford for one family member to be the informed exception in that family, or for one class one student in the class to be the one that understands. We just can't do that anymore. We have to normalize this. We have to normalize the understanding of climate change, the understanding of what we can do. And it has to be no longer something that is esoteric and pursued by a few enlightened beings. It has to be normalized. It's affecting every single human being. And so it has to be taken to your homerooms, to your kitchen tables, to your dorm rooms, everywhere where you are. You have to talk to your friends, very often your family members, your parents, your grandparents are astonishingly ignorant about this. So educate everyone, educate, educate, educate.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tom and Christiana, for joining us today. To everyone who is listening, you all should have been shared with a link to The Future We Choose, and we really do recommend that you all try to read it if possible, to take some of the ideas that Christiana and Tom shared with us into your own lives.
Can I also point out, we also host a podcast every week. It's called Outrage and Optimism. So we've got very fun podcast. So join. We're obviously a bit obsessed with the US election at the moment, but it's not the only thing we talk about.
Wonderful. So check out the podcast as well. Thank you both, and enjoy
Bye.
the rest of the
Bye. Thanks.
Cut.
Okay.